So I wanted to give an account that I'll give sort of two projects, and one will end with this large book. I'm a terrible salesperson, but I will tell you now and at the end that you can buy your very own copy for 50 crowns, which is a screaming deal. So please consider this. They're for sale out there. This book, we'll get to it, but I'm holding it to kind of flag it. Yeah, so I think about 2016 or 17, I was really trying to figure out how to put together a few different things in terms of how value is produced and circulates today in a very broad sense. And for some reason, even though I was based in the US at this time, I had some connections to Sweden, and I found myself broadly to this region, I think because the first Facebook data center had been attracting some international attention that people probably know about. And I really wanted to try to understand the relationship between maybe, let's say, like 3 sets of movement in the world, and to try to make sense of how data and IT infrastructure was moving around. And then at the same time, how this sort of narrative about a kind of more futuristic, whether it's a sort of surveillance capitalism or a kind of techno-utopian ideal, how those things did and did not intersect. Sorry, I forgot to start my timer, so I know when I've spoken for 20 minutes, so I'll give myself some way. How those things do and do not intersect with other forms of labor in the same region, right? And so I'm very happy that we'll hear from Johannes later, because I became very interested in how we understand, let's say, the laws and livelihoods and experiences of migrant Thai berry pickers in the same moment, in the same place relatively, as a very different representation of labor within a data center or within a kind of tech industry, and that we need to sort of think of these things as concurrent and part of a larger puzzle. And for me, that puzzle was actually to try to understand what are the points of intersection where we can actually kind of interact with, or as artists or cultural workers actually kind of engage topics that seem like so systemic and so broad that we actually don't have so much traction, right? And I had done things about various sort of histories of neoliberal capitalism. Before that, I'd also done things about migration rights and struggles, and I think, so it's quite nice for me to present today, because I spent some time trying to figure out what we actually can learn from how different ways of working in different fields are represented, and I think if we find the same kind of coincidence, right, things overlapping in one region, it's actually not a coincidence, right? They're actually all part of the same thing. So that also means that we're dealing with different conditions of visibility and opacity. So, and I know we'll get some, I sort of queued up some data center stuff, because I think we'll get more of that, but this is an architectural model of a data center. This is one actually outside of Vienna. But because this biennial has a kind of design emphasis, I also am fascinated with this, because it's really a design that's not meant to be attracting much attention or be noticed, right? And so if we talk about what's happening in landscapes like this one, some of us had the privilege of visiting a cold storage warehouse for berries this morning. These are facilities that actually take up a massive amount of space, that are, in terms of capital, actually very, very productive, but they're seen regionally as somewhat peripheral, when in fact I think they play a very central role in certain operations of how things are circulating in the world. So, and of course we get a bit of reportage of trying to access a Facebook data center that is really not so interested in being accessed. And I'm also very, very interested in place names like Datawagen, the kind of, but also the fact that, you know, you have a more spectacular architecture, but then also a lot of kind of temporary fencing and do not enter signs that in fact are not very beautiful, right? So if we think about the kind of aesthetic that we are presented with via like various sort of apps or platforms, it's very smooth, it's very fluid. Already we see that there's more friction in how one would deal with that, right? And then, I had a very nice little bike ride and walk where this private security vehicle just kind of kept pace with me, and we went up and down this fence for a few minutes, and I moved, he moved, and back and forth. So I think, one of the things that several of us today will hopefully discuss is just sort of what these kind of relatively simplistic investigations that could seem not terribly intelligent in a way. Like I went to a data center I knew I couldn't access, but what we can learn from this kind of, like what sort of information is yielded from that kind of geography. And so at some point I became very interested in the kind of mismatch between what it was like to experience certain places or to talk to people who knew about them firsthand, and then how those were represented. This is a little Amsterdam thing. So, slight footnote, but I think often data centers are not so accessible, and I think it's of interest to me the kind of data generated by a more fluid, seamless, fun, leisurely idea of urban life is not really one that intersects with any notion of what the infrastructure is or people are who are underpinning that. And then the exception that people often point to is this data tower in Amsterdam that's part of the University of Amsterdam. It's sort of a scientific project. It's a tower. You're supposed to say there's data here. This is very serious. Here, I think I show it actually because as a sort of design principle, there's a barrier that's made of containers. And this actually there's no sort of container facility or shipping or anything going on in this area, so that the containers are purely here to kind of make some connection between data and things moving around. And I'm not sure what that implication actually means, but I think it's quite interesting that the containers are sort of dropped as a barrier that kind of interrupt the notion of a sort of massive scientific, powerful amassing of data. But also I knew we had a kind of Dutch connection, so I throw this in here. And then as we talk about mobility, I wanted to also, this is from a logistics trade fair in Gothenburg, and this system has been adopted on Stockholm. It's sort of the ticket check for the guards on the subway. But what I think is very interesting if we think about human mobility and data mobility is actually it's the same software platform that's doing shipping logistics and e-commerce, sort of retail point of sale stuff, and this body-worn surveillance mechanism, right? So I think there's something very important to try to point to about how systems for mobility or circulation are also ones that very much are kind of preventing mobility, structures of control, right? And so the fact that it's the same vendor offering all of them to me is quite interesting. And then of course, it's always, since we're close to the sea, it's very important to remember these undersea internet cables that are kind of powering the whole system, right? So, and I think one of the things that I would say is of interest to me is that the paths for these cables are often the same as cargo shipping. That it's often the same vendors running ships that repair them, and often the same sort of way that things move. So as I was saying in the van this morning, our goods move and our data moves sort of in the same path. It's just sort of a different speed and a different conduit. So I think if we sort of think of digital material as immaterial and cargo as heavy material, in fact, there's a kind of, there's more similarity than we would think of. So some of the research I started doing in this area was published in a book in 2020 called Data Publics that I couldn't find a very good cover image of, so I guess I found one for a book launch event. And I can share with you my chapter because the book is somehow like over 100 pounds at this point, so it's, but what I did in that book was I basically brought together a bunch of notes about the things I've been talking about, that I was trying to make a film. I realized that I actually could not make this film, I didn't really have the means, and so I wrote a kind of text that was not necessarily hard research, but a series of clips that I thought brought together these different conditions. And I just wanted to sort of show these three quotes together, because in 2017 there was also a sort of tourism campaign where Sweden posted all of Airbnb, like it posted sort of all of this sort of public land on Airbnb as like, come camp here, and it was sort of listed on Airbnb as a stunt. I thought this was quite telling because at the same time Sweden's migration policy had changed quite drastically. It's now changed even more. And so obviously there's a kind of address of, sort of for whom this publicness was being kind of advertised. And in terms of connecting berries and Bitcoin, I think there's a question about publicly generated data or infrastructures like power, sort of land, and then also public lands that are being used for picking of berries, right? And so there, as people who are based in Sweden probably know, there's this kind of question about the right to public passage based in part on what was seen as an abuse by companies that were bringing in migrant labor to harvest a large amount of berries. If I'm correct, maybe Johannes will tell us about this more later, but I get very interested in the notion of sort of publicness in rite of passage, and then also in terms of, if we look at the Facebook data center, this is publicly generated data that if you have used Facebook within the EU, you probably have some connection to the space, and yet we have no right to access this, right? And so I think there's a question about how we understand such spaces as public infrastructures. Okay, so here we have three quotes. One is from Airbnb. One is a kind of quote about migration and reality that I thought was quite interesting. And then one is from Facebook. There's a typo where we don't have the year, but I think it was also 2017, 2018. Facebook sort of saying, sort of using the Swedishness of IKEA to say, like, we're going to revolutionize sort of rapid prototyping of data centers and build them quite quickly. And I tried to kind of say, these things happen in the same region. What does that mean for how value is produced? That sort of thing. And it's in black and white because I think it was a failed film, so it was, or not failed, but it didn't come from, but it became a bit more cinematic. So I can narrate. This is a data center in Stockholm with these very high security locks, but looks like many data centers inside. And then I thought this meatball sauce that IKEA was selling using this word allemansrätten was an interesting sort of symptom based on political debates about this. So, and then I think this will lead to the next project. I became very interested in sort of how regions were represented as a selling point, going so far as to interview a sort of Swedish Chamber of Commerce executive in Silicon Valley who brokers deals for tech companies trying to build data centers here. So there are a lot of promotional materials like this that maybe some people have seen. I thought this was really interesting, and in color it's obviously a more kind of Northern Lights, Green Lights, but it's very interesting to sort of show this landscape as a completely depopulated, non-industrialized landscape, right? It's a completely sort of natural territory to be cultivated or expropriated by data centers, but I thought the fact that there's no technology in this image, and so that imaginary as a kind of was something that was very another data center. Yeah, and then Encore mentioned this, and so I published this essay, which I'm happy to circulate, and then I ran a study group for a bit when I was based in Gothenburg called Bits, Bodies, Berries, Boats, Boundaries. At some point, I started involving ports as well, the sort of question about logistics. I would say this image to me is also very interesting because it's like a hipster coffee kiosk that was a container and then was returned to the port. So it was like a sort of pop-up. So it says creative space, but it's actually now behind a fence and has been sort of de-creativized. So just as a kind of joke to keep myself amused. So at a certain point, this question of a kind of representation of natural landscapes and their kind of pull for the tech industry became of great interest to me and others. And so at a certain point with 3 other people, now I hold up this book again, which is for sale for a measly 50 crowns. I received funding to do a small project investigating initially more about invisible labor and what's called ghost work in the tech sector, which people may have heard about, and specifically labor that's needed for machine learning, human labor that's not acknowledged, to clean data sets, to sort of feed things into machine learning algorithms. We were quite interested in doing site visits, more sort of like the stuff I've been detailing. And then the pandemic happened and we weren't able to do any of that. And what we instead switched to were, in the fields we were investigating, we became very interested in kind of representations of natural ecologies, a kind of sort of naturalization of data as an industry. Here, this is a kind of mind map. It's very blue. We're really interested in this kind of use of blues and water, the cloud, the swamp, the lake. But it's also quite messy. And so we had a project where we essentially could not meet as a group or travel, and at a certain point we decided that we would involve others to kind of help us figure out what we're working on. So then we sent this single image to a bunch of people and asked them with a sort of page explanation of the research topic and asked them to kind of respond in some form to this image. And it became this book that you have here. And also became a record via a lot of XML code of the frustration of trying to actually work together over these 2 years. So there was a kind of Slack channel that we communicated with as a group, if people know this app, and we asked the designers of the book to capture the tone of this, the frustration or the sort of confusion of this, and they said sure, and they could you export the Slack channel for us, and we gave them this large pile of code. And their proposal was actually to reproduce a lot of that, or almost all of it, in the book. So there's sort of topics, you see their contribution, and all the topics are actually in XML code, the 4 of us who worked on the project trying to make sense of it, which is quite a sort of thorny design or sort of proposition. But I think in a way it kind of generated the messiness of data as a field that we were dealing with. There's also a companion site that you're welcome to visit, realityharvester.bargains, that as this project became much more about how different tech industries were representing themselves and sort of, so the book is called Reality Harvester, Nature After Data After Nature, and of course we know that nature is kind of a social construction as well, but we thought that data kind of pulling in all of these kind of natural metaphors was basically covering over the fact that a lot of these industries are using a lot of electricity or using a lot of land, or so as we see in other places, that they are sort of very massive operations. They're often just not geographically proximate to people who would sort of witness this activity, right? And so that's why an event like this is quite important. But this site is actually quite quite non-informative. It's sort of a map that doesn't become a map. And so a lot of links, as well as the book, are buried within this site, but it keeps purporting to kind of answer or solve something, and it does not. And I think that as a sort of group before, we felt like this was sort of honest, because we in fact have not solved anything in this process, but sort of to show a more contingent set of actions. Okay.
So if you press
Yeah.
speak louder, it
Yeah.
it's full screen.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't know if that's totally. Yeah, you can do. Okay, thank you. So I guess in sort of presenting two projects, one is this idea of off-sightedness of a lot of data industries, and also the way that migration policies are dealt with, that they're not necessarily rendered that visible unless work is done to that. So that's one, and then also is this idea of what we call reality harvester, of a kind of veneer of something that was drawing on notions of reality, but producing other forms of value on top of that. And so I would sort of say, and that those things are visible in certain ways in our world. So I'll start with this cover, which is an AI-generated charcoal drawing of a news story that came up in early 2021, which was that delivery workers outside of Whole Foods, which is an Amazon-owned sort of organic food store in the US, were getting second. See, we go back to, yeah, you can see there. We're getting second phone handsets and hanging them in a tree in a shopping center in order to trick the geolocation of the delivery app and be assigned deliveries first. And so if you hung your phone in a tree, then the algorithm would see you as being closest to the store. And so you would get the first call to the store. And so what that meant was that you had a sort of shopping center and a tree and lots of phones hanging out of it. And then, of course, this was reported, and within a few days, the system was changed and made sort of to be more fair, that you couldn't do this kind of hack. And we thought that stories like this are actually quite compelling because they change how, for a moment, how we experience the kind of visual world around us. But rather than being sort of glitches or problems with the system, they're actually showing the actual operations of the system, right? That people would be so desperate to be first to respond that you would need to kind of mob the tree with these phone handsets. And that also the tree itself planted in a kind of suburban concrete shopping center is sort of a meager excuse for actually existing nature, right? So these to us were like very sort of interesting intersections. And then, because we started with berries, and I know we'll have berries more, I wanted to end with this still from a promotional ad from the Swedish Tourism Council that also is very sort of idyllic and about nature, but I kind of like reading this text a bit against the grain, that like we all get something from nature, you know, that it can be extractive, and I think maybe lead into some other presentations today. So those are, I think, a sort of set of field notes about two projects that I see as related. I hope they've been relatively coherent in my informal presentation. Yeah, but let's have a conversation.
Great.
Yeah.
But so my name is Johannes Samuelsson, and I am an artist and documentary photographer and teacher based in Umeå. And I'm gonna talk about. I will give an introduction to the berry industry, and then I'll focus on the question of freezing or the fridges. I just want to compliment the hanging and the work around this room, which I really happy with, and I'm really happy with these straw objects from Berit's Straw Museum in Sörby. I'm planning to visit them tomorrow to see the actual museum. And this is a small part of the photos I've been photographing since 2012. It started with that place, photos from Brattby Vårdhem, which is an old healthcare facility outside Umeå. And it started as a collaboration between me and Madeleine Eriksson, who is a culture geographer who lives in Umeå. She is from Fredrika, which is, the pictures here are from Fredrika. But we've also been working with another culture geographer. Her name is Aina Tollefsen. And she has a friend that's involved very much in the buying or structuring parts of the depots in the berry industry, and that friendship also made it possible for us and for me to get contacts with these depots where berries are bought, more or less. And one of these depots, which is not longer active, it's a freezer. It was a freezer in Balsjö outside Umeå, run by a man. His name is Arne. When he went into pension, they closed it down because it was only he who could manage the freezer, and they didn't want to invest more money and make it. It was quite old machines running that freezer. And today we had the very fortunate situation where some of us could go and visit another node in the same company's system of freezing berries. It was in Öjebyn. That was really interesting for me. What I'm gonna do now is to say some words about the process or my method, and then I'll read a text about the berry industry. So my project goes on and off. The berry industry, or the berry seasons, which is also the name of the book and the project. I've written a book about the different field visits that I've done together with the culture geographers. In the beginning, we were supposed to create a book together with my photos and their texts, and it was supposed to be a kind of accessible version of their academic research. For different reasons, I wrote it myself. And writing and reading has been a big part of the project. Even though I'm a visual artist, I come from a tradition of documentary photography, I would say. My first inspiration was Sune Jonsson, if you have heard about that. More ethnological photographer based in Umeå at the museum, Västerbotten's museum. But he was also writing, of course. And what I realized that I'm always late when I'm photographing. I'm always behind capital, more or less, or this. I'm never there when there's, except maybe when it was a berry strike in Umeå 2013, when it was very close to my home. Then But then it was really complicated to photograph also, because didn't have a clear role as a photographer there. And that picture is from that berry strike. I'll talk about that more. But being late also means that it's kind of the process is about understanding the traces of the industry. So I'm quite good at seeing the traces and seeing. Eventually, you get good at something when you do it a lot. But then trying to understand what the traces represent has been a lot about the work, my work. What has been very complicated, and I think that Benjamin touches upon it, it's the language problems. Because many of the workers who pick berries don't speak Swedish or English. Most of them today are from Thailand today. And so I've been dependent on a translator, which is a friend now. His name is Adisak Namwai, but he has other work. So and then we also talk about the problem of not having economy to do this kind of big documentation problems, I would say. So part of that is coming here, because it makes me be able to travel and makes me be able to talk about the project, but then also I can photograph at the same time. Now I'm going to read a part. The same part is in Swedish in the book, but it's also, now I've updated it a bit. Wild blueberries, also called bilberries in English. If you say blueberries, they're usually American blueberries and they're grown. But in Sweden we say blåbär, and that means wild grown blueberries. Lingonberries, cloudberries. The industry is unique. The raw material is free, and thanks to the right of public access, you call it something else.
Public passage, but
Public
access
passage.
probably-
Everyone has access to the glory. Each year, around 25,000 tons of wild berries are picked in Sweden. So the facility today, where we visited, that collected 3,600 tons of berries. And I imagine that these numbers are larger than, like, probably pick more than 25,000 tons each year. They have some years on its neck. This corresponds to approximately 4% of the total amount of berries, 600,000 tons, that grow in the country's forests. Many of the berries that are picked in Sweden are clean and frozen from processing abroad. Wild blueberries in particular have recently become an attractive commodity in the Asian market. They contain high values of antioxidant, which makes them useful ingredients in the health industry and cosmetics. Calculations from 2013 show that around 80% of the wild blueberries are shipped off to be processed in Asia, the United States, and Europe. Despite the large availability of berries in the Swedish forests, paradoxically, large quantities of imported cultivated blueberries are eaten in Sweden. If you buy lingonberries like Änglamarks, you will see that there are Chinese berries in those also, both Swedish and Chinese. There are mainly two types of berry pickers that are active in Sweden. The first pickers are pickers with work permits from Thailand. And most of them are rice farmers from the northeastern parts of the country. Because they have work visas, they are known in the industry as visa pickers. In Swedish it's called viseringsplockare. During the berry season, the visa pickers are employed by Thai staffing companies, which among other things handle logistics around travels and visas. Furthermore, there are so-called free pickers, who according to Swedish tax rules must pick berries at their own risk. They must not be organized by companies that want to avoid employer liabilities. However, few in the industry trust that the free pickers are not organized by companies. Because they operate within a fairly unprotected, externally almost invisible part of the labor market, there is an overall risk of exploitation. The majority of the free pickers come from Eastern Europe. The free movement within the EU makes it possible for them to come to Sweden and work in the country. The berries they pick are sold at so-called berry buyers, or in Swedish, bäruppköp. These are available in a variety of sizes and constellations, and these are decreasing over the years now. So there are less of these small berry buyers today than it was 2 years ago, 5 years ago. The joint function of the berry buyers is to sell the berries to the wholesalers. So today we visited a wholesalers, one of their nodes, one of their freezers. And that company I will talk about a bit. This means that the free picking is in principle completely unregulated. In recent years, the small berry buyers and the free pickers, they are decreasing, as I said. And the bigger companies and the visa pickers, they are increasing in activities. There are two companies who dominate the Swedish berry industry. Olle Svensson AB and Polarica. Olle Svensson AB buys berries from both free pickers and visa pickers, usually via middlemen, while Polarica has announced that they only buy berries from their own visa pickers. There have been a lot of scandals within the berry industry. The berry pickers are the one that takes the biggest risk. And there are numerous cases of situations where pickers have not been paid or been housed in really bad housing. One of the most known berry picker strikes took place in Umeå in 2013, and that picture is from after that strike. And I didn't have my own camera when I found that bucket, so I took a photo with my mobile phone, and then I put it in a bush to come back and photograph it later with like a larger format. And then it was gone when I came the next day. So that is a mobile phone picture. The Thai berry pickers are usually in debt when they start picking in the Swedish forest, because they pay for visa and travels and accommodation, everything, they pay for that themselves. And they work hard to pay off the debts before they can be able to earn some money to bring home, usually at the end of the season. I think it's since 2010, I can be wrong on the year here, but the visa pickers have a contract. It's a collective agreement with a guaranteed minimum salary, but it seems like it's mainly on paper. Many of the pickers are offered to work on, I'm not sure if this is, I've been Google translating, piecework salary accord. Is it a correct? Like when you get money, if you the more you pick, the more money you get.
Yeah.
What's it called in commission? Let's say commission. Because they're offered to choose this instead of the guaranteed salary, which the guaranteed contract is almost something that's just shown for the Swedish unions and migratory department. Because the minimum guaranteed salary seems too little when they come and already have debt, so they want a chance and pick more. In the past, it has mainly been smaller, very unserious companies who have been involved in the scandals. It has usually been also the same persons that come back with new companies that trick other pickers or Polarica, which is one of the big companies, was perceived to be in breach of social conduct and labor improvements. But at the moment, their CEO of Polarica is under charge for trafficking, and that charge is in Finland, but they are active in Sweden also. They are active in Poland, Sweden, and Finland. And he has left his position. And this also means that Polarica has a hard time selling some of their berries to ICA and Coop, and their berry freezers are full, at least what I heard. And with the electricity price now, it's a quite critical situation, I would say. And I will try to explain how the freezers works now, or how the system of the freezers works. Freezing is perhaps the most important link in the raw material chain. The berries spoil quickly, and the transport must work quickly and smoothly. Increasingly larger volumes of berries have come into circulation during the last decade, which places new demands on efficiency in handling. The need for both freezing and storage capacity has increased. Ole Svensson AB and Polarica have changed and rationalized the production chains, not least to optimize the placement of depots, freezers, production facilities with cleaning or overpicking, it's called, and packaging, as well as the final stock for export to domestic sales. Smaller berry companies rarely freeze berries in Sweden. They sell directly to foreign freezers and production facilities. The two large companies, on the other hand, have strengthened their control over their supply chains, from picking to production to transport to the customer. And this is a node that was active for a long time. It was owned by a company called Riab or Hiab. It's two companies. And that company owns that building now in Boden. It's an old regiment's building, military building. And they own it for housing Thai berry pickers. And they were here this summer, and it was used, I think, the summer before also. But that company, this is quite typical for the berry industry. They sold their freezing facility to Ole Svensson, the company that we visited today. And when the person who worked there got into pension, it was closed in 2017. Ole Svensson owns freezers in Öjebyn, where we were today, and Ånge, and in Olofström. Olofström is in Blekinge. In addition to the production facility with cleaning and packaging, Olofström also houses the main warehouse for the frozen products. There is a special situation within the berry industry, which means that the wholesaler stores the berries for the customers, and this is the critical part for Polarica, which means that they have to invest in relatively large storage capacity, which we saw today. And another specific thing around the industry is the distinction between the picking period, which is between August and September, or late July and September, and the production period in fine cleaning and packaging, which can last all year. Once the berries are frozen, the berries they can be cleaned and packaged at a later time. The geographically dispersed picking of the berries in northern Sweden and the transport to depots and freezers therefore appear to be the most difficult to plan and a critical moment in the chain. If bottlenecks occurs in freezers or warehouses, this means a risk for the migrant workers, according to various reports and also what I've seen in my research. It has happened that they can be dismissed early due to a labor shortage. That has at least happened before. So what happens then is that the companies have been saying the freezers are full, you can't pick more. And then they end up in a really shitty situation because they work on commission. And then there's a part of the book where the company has taken the workers' keys to the cars, so they can't move and pick. And they are not allowed to sell the berries to anyone else, at least the Thai berry pickers. So that's part of, you have probably heard about migrant work laws where the ones coming are connected to the company very close. Then they have to bear the cost of living and accommodation at the same time as there is no income. The time until the return trip to Thailand can be very costly. At the same time, the companies have save money in missed salary payments for a few weeks. So in this way, the freezers become a way of disciplining the workers. Another big problem, or a way to discipline the workers or to exploit them, is that in the berry industry, you don't talk about the price of labor. You talk about the price of berries. And that is not known for the berry pickers before they arrive. So they don't know if it's going to be a high price or low price. So last year it was good, then it was over 20 crowns. But usually I've seen it's been around 12 crowns. So that's a crazy situation. And that creates a situation, because they are in debt, especially the Thai berry pickers. It's a modern slavery in many cases. And the state is not interested in this business. There's no state institution that cares about it, or you can't. It's hard to know who to go to, and the unions only represent already union members, which means there's no union at the moment that are really interested to help with the situation. And the language problems I also talked about. I think that's kind of sammanfattning. What's that in English?
Summary.
What?
Summary.
Summary of kind of the berry industry, and also in relation to the freezers, and also to the exhibition. For me, it has been good to be thinking about these nodes, especially on the freezers the late days, because I just decided that we were going to visit a freezer, so I needed to think about it. But I also want to say that there have been two trends in my research. It has been about the raw material chain. So I've been following the berries. I've been to health ingredients fair in Frankfurt. I've been looking at these depots in Sweden. And what happens in China when the berries are exported and extracted somehow into a pulver, or where the sugar and the water is extracted, that process is quite invisible. That's hard to get into a Chinese facility. My father had a friend who were gonna try to engage in this, but he never saw anything. It was really clean around when he was there. And the next chapter, or the next thread that I'm following, is there are 3 pictures there from Boden and Gunnarsbyn, and it's about the housing, or the houses involved in this industry, I would say, and I will try to think about those through the lens of the berry industry, and also all the talks about green steel and stuff.
Green steel, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mm.
Yeah, we are here in a research trip on data storage. So it will be super interesting to have your feedback. But I'm going to take you first to other territories that seem to be a bit far, but might not be that far from here. At least they are connected. And the reason why I started to work on data storage and data centers was because I was working on the digital infrastructure, trying to identify different spaces and architectures, part of that infrastructure. Some of them were automated spaces in the Netherlands, and then following where the data was generated or produced or consumed, I followed the cable landing points, data centers, and finally spaces like this one. That is in Atacama in Chile, where lithium is produced or extracted from the layers of the desert to create later batteries that are used for our mobile phones, computers, batteries for data centers, but also battery storage for solar panels, wind turbines, etc. For me, what is interesting is the idea of progress that are behind all these infrastructures, that we all know that we have reached a limit where we cannot continue producing and consuming in the same way. But yet, instead of changing patterns, changing forms of living, we always try to find a new formula to keep on going, and a kind of new magical trick that will make us continue being faster, bigger, and consuming as we have been so far. And one of these formulas, these magic tricks, is lithium. That is an element that is portrayed as key for the transition to renewable energies. Lithium is found in very little places on Earth in high concentrations. One of them is La Puna de Atacama, or also called the lithium triangle, that comprises Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. In those regions that contain lithium, water is a very scarce element as well. And most of the communities, human and non-human, that are living in that region depend on water. But as these waters have high concentration of salts and minerals, the extractivist industries are depleting entire ecosystems and reservoirs of water. Not far from the lithium ponds, where mining companies are extracting almost 2,000 liters per second from the deepest layers of the desert, and where thousands of millions of liters of water are evaporated annually to run the digital industry, the metaverse, and all these new dreams we have. The Atacameño communities subsist through more than human forms of solidarity. So what happens is that the waters are underneath and they contain minerals, so they are extracted, pumped to the surface, and let to evaporate with the sun and the dry conditions of the weather in Atacama. So this not only pumping the water and depleting the reservoirs that are used by the communities nearby, but also evaporating those waters to concentrate the salts and generate lithium, or be able to take the concentrate. This is Toconao. It's a small village that the name means place of stones. It's one of the settlements in this area, and it's thought to be back 12,000 years, making it a historical important region. Water is essential for the communities that live in places like Toconao and in San Pedro de Atacama. They are communal, and customary indigenous norms apply for their administration. So there are a series of canals and ponds that store the water, keep the water, and redistribute it. So everyone in the community can use a little bit of this water for also irrigation purposes, to have little gardens with vegetables and form to also drink also for animals. The maintenance is organized by la Comunidad de Regantes, or irrigation community, and no one will take another turn that is not theirs, because they know that otherwise someone else will not have water. So these are some of the barriers that regulate the flow of water in places like Toconac. I'm also interested in the architecture in that region. Most of the traditional houses will orient towards Licancabur, the volcano, because it shows the beginning of the day, but also of life. And there is this notion that no one owns the land or the resources. So if you are going to build a house, you first ask for permission, also to the ancestors, and make an offering, in the sense that most of the practices are not based on taking, but on giving back. Atacameños know that the Atacama ground is alive. Most of the times, Atacama Desert is portrayed as a lifeless space, or even a resource place, a place where to take resources and export them to very other regions in the world. But the ground is full of life. For instance, Cristina Dorador, who is a biologist, also part of the commission that was writing the new constitution in Chile, identifies the cyanobacteria that are inhabiting those salares and that were fundamental for the creation of the conditions of life in the planet, and are also fundamental, these microorganisms, for the entire ecosystem in Atacama. Not only through the lens of biology, but also the indigenous cosmologies, the ground is also alive, of course. So there are different ways in which the communities that live in the Atacama, but also are fighting for maintaining this ecosystem that is degrading by extracting the water, are identifying this place as not lifeless, but full of life. But the mining industry see it differently. This is the cadastre, so you see the mining concessions in Atacama, so it's quite full, and this kind of rational Cartesian logic that permeates this entire region, compartmenting the soil and abstracting it to be able to be extracted, so transforming it then to commodities. And there is a big opening.
Sorry, what's the green and what's the...
Some different types of concessions. Some of them are exploitation, or like kind of extraction already, and others are like exploration. And there is a big opening that at the beginning I thought it was a kind of protected area, but no, it's like a one concession of one company that is called for Esquem, and is where the mining, like the lithium mines that I showed before are. So this belongs to one particular company that used to be state-run, but actually also sells most of it to other companies. So protecting this unique environment from the devastating effects of mining and the neoliberal economy that sustained that has been at the forefront of the struggles of the indigenous communities in the region, and many other people like lawyers and biologists and other people invested in those struggles. And they try to denaturalize this idea that the soil is alive, is lifeless, but they pointed it that it's alive. And this is something that I really like. You know that sometimes the lithium batteries get too warm and explode. That's why sometimes in the plains they are warning about having some lithium batteries. And for me, it's kind of the revenge of the cyanobacteria. So what I always say is that when we take our phones, we should imagine that this piece of lithium that we have inside it is alive, that brings all these elements and microorganisms from the Salares de Atacama. And it's somehow the cyanobacteria sometimes revolt. But I like to have those images to counter the logic of these beautiful images of the ponds, so like colorful, that blind us from the realities on the ground and the effect that these extracting companies have in the entire ecosystem. So against this pervasiveness of these beautiful images and the colorful, we have to look what happens as well. And try to, unpack the industries that believe that lithium will, solve the question of energy as before coal or, oil did before. Water is extracted all over the desert to run these industries. So alongside the desert, we see kind of these pumps that help to recirculate the water. And these are affecting the level of water, the aquifer in the entire region. So when we travel through Atacama, we see also these tubes of water that we don't know they are going in and out. In some cases, they are going in and out of the mines. And they take us to different territories. Some of them are the housing for the miners and the people working in the mine. Some of them are migrant workers from the region, because most of the engineers live in Calama nearby and generally go back and forth in planes, and they don't stay there. But also they serve, the extractive of water are also the housing or like the hotels that are supporting the industry of tourism that is also complicit of people like me that goes to do research. But these tubes go even further. They go also to regions like Shenzhen and China. This is one of the companies that got the approval from the Chilean government to get extraction of lithium. What is interesting is this company is in charge of producing batteries, solar panels, electric vehicles, and so on. So using and acquiring the rights to exploit lithium will make them control the entire chain, from element to product to end product. The name of this company is Build Your Dreams. And it makes us think what it takes to build our dreams. How much effort, how much scales of operation, and the consequences of our dreams have in different territories. And I'm not claiming, I'm not against Build Your Dreams or any other companies, but thinking through this idea of the dreams of the smart city, the Internet of Things, the metaverse, or the dreams of big entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and companies like Tesla, that make us imagining that changing existing cars for electric cars will make the trick as well, whereas we know that if we don't change the scale of operation, the consequences will be enormous anyway for the environment. Lithium also fuels the spaces that are next to my place, like the automated factories and data centers near Rotterdam. Also places of extreme beauty, or let's say sublime aesthetics that run depending on huge amounts of data and produce and consume data. Also depending on migrant workers, in this case from East Europe. And also these infrastructures that I'm doing research on currently. So I got this grant from Harvard to follow different models of data centers, and that's why I'm here. The interest that I have on this is some of these graphs that says how much data we have generated in the last years and what are the expectations of data generated. And I like it to save or not to save data, that is the question. So it's also a question not only producing, how much data we produce, how much data we consume, and how much we need to keep. But we are keeping quite a lot, and these are the numbers. So you see the number of data centers in the different countries. Remarkably, the Netherlands, where I live, is quite high in the top. It's remarkable because it's quite a small country. So certain countries, as Benjamin was saying, they have certain conditions that land is cheap, or the energy is available. There are tax regimes that are favorable, and they make it quite attractive for these companies to be located there. Generally, this is the boring image of the data center, like a bunch of servers working 24/7. But for me, this is also the other image of the data center, the counter image, or this one. I mean, this is the same, it's more beautiful, but at the end, it's like big infrastructures of extraction that are connected to the cloud. So data centers are dependent on increasing land and energy consumption and extractivist practices. Their footprint accounts for more than 2% or more of global carbon emissions. That is the equivalent of the airline industry, and is expected to rise 14%. this is a point that to me is also key, that is said by the data industry, well, in Gartner market trends. The area of potential insufficiency, so meaning that how data centers are growing and how data production is growing, and the moment in which there are not enough data centers for the amount of data that we are creating. So it's coming soon, apparently. So then the logic will be that we create more data centers. Well, but we know what it implies to create more data centers. So it's kind of this tension between we are creating a lot of data, not only as individuals, but also the industries of health industries that we also depend on, electromobility, and many others. So it's something we have to take into account, because while we are creating new worlds, many of them, like the metaverse, that also require quite a lot of amounts of data, we are also putting at risk the very world that we all share. And there is some tension there that we have to acknowledge and take a position on. Some people are. For instance, recently neighbors in the Netherlands protested a data center by Meta, and they paralyzed the project, they stopped the project, but also triggered the government of the Netherlands to create a hyperscale data center ban in the Netherlands until new solutions are taken for the industry to acknowledge or to solve the problem of energy consumption and water consumption. So these are some of the protests. There's quite a small village, but in a way it was very active, and I bring this because sometimes mobilization of population allows for policy change. These are the same, I have many of cases, but just to bring a few, the same a protest against also a data center in Santiago de Chile in the region of Cerrillos, also affected by water shortages. So the community was, how come we are experiencing drought and we are going to have a data center next door that is consuming so much water to refrigerate the servers. So there are also policy being taken into account right now, this question, European Code of Conduct of data centers. And there are major players like of all sorts stepping in to investigate new solutions. For instance, CBRE, this major real estate company in the world, is the biggest real estate company, has created a new division of data centers, meaning that they are not only interested in as infrastructures, but also prime real estate locations. Architectural firms like Scott Brewery, Arup, and many others are also having new divisions of data center design to try to come up with solutions or ideas about how to combine uses, as we were saying before, like connecting data centers to farms, or connecting data centers to housing developments, or even using infrastructures that are being obsolete or decommissioned, like the oil rigs, to transform them in data centers, because actually the fiber optic cables are passing by very closely. I've been investigating and will visit some of these developments, for instance, question of land, then floating data centers as a solution, or underwater data centers to say, instead of having to refrigerate the servers, we use the temperature of the water to, maintain a constant temperature. So there have been different examples of this type of underwater data centers by Microsoft. Others, and this is one of my former students of the RCA, is thinking about a decentralization of data centers. Instead of big data centers as hyperscale, what if we will have, each of us, a portion of a data center in our houses, and data centers will be managed at the level of the neighborhood. Also changing the logic of data governance and data ownership. And just a bit more advanced in the future, but experiments that are being developed as we talk, using other mediums, so not that much transforming the architecture of the data center, but the very medium of the storage of data. So many laboratories are exploring DNA as a medium that is very compact, doesn't need energy to be maintained and has a very long life, almost by millennia. And also is something that won't become obsolete because as is part of our system, there will be always a system to code and decode DNA. So there are many experiments thinking about long-term storage through DNA, also for libraries and museums and collections and other repositories of data that doesn't need to be used immediately. And there are some people in the industry that are even thinking about what if the human body will become a data center. But let's give it a space for the discussion. Every solution has an impact. For instance, Singapore had a ban on data centers for some time because of questions of land, scarcity and energy, and they decided to do some tests like floating data centers as the one we saw, but in larger scale. What is the outcome? That they also need these huge infrastructures of renewable energy like solar panels that I imagine will have quite an impact in the marine ecosystem. Similarly, in China, these small scale tests that Microsoft did for underwater data storage have become part of the 5-year plans in 3 Chinese provinces, meaning that this is not going to be just a fantasy, it's going to be implemented in large scale in China. And I also imagine that having data centers underwater, dissipating energy and heat will also have an effect in the marine ecologies in those regions. We go north. This is one of the data centers, Verne Global. We are going to visit in Iceland, near Reykjavik. This question of the Nordic countries and all places in the north, acknowledging that they have renewable energy and they have cold weather, so it's an attractive spot for data centers, as this is the case of also Sweden and this region. That's why we are here. Places like Facebook. And we were talking before about even these kind of proposals of using the heat, dissipated heat, to use it for other uses like residency developments. I refer to Julia Belkova. Julia Belkova is a researcher based in Stockholm, and she has been doing research exactly what I explained before, that sometimes we are just incentivizing the more consumption of data to be able to hit these other developments. So it's kind of a trap in itself. And not only that, many of the, as you know, the developments connected to renewable energy that then are used to serve some of these infrastructures, to label them sustainable, are also affecting the communities of the Sami communities and the life of the reindeers. So at the end, for me, what happens is this idea that I use of Michael Marder, the notion of energy dreams, and how much we imagine energy as something that is extracted, stored, that is always in the deep layers of the earth, or something that we have to take, accumulate, and later release, instead of something that we can imagine differently. So there is a question about progress that has to be redefined, but also how we imagine our relation to energy. Not only, because even though we have been using different sources of energy, the consumption has been growing exponentially. So I imagine that even we find new sources of energy, at some point we have to redefine consumption and relation to energy. This image in Atacama says more or less everything. It says, do I drink lithium? Do I eat copper? Kind of making the tension between our search for energy and the effects that it has on life. And attention that is even more explicit recently with drought that is happening in regions in Chile, and where you have to take the decision if water is used by mining companies or populations in the desert. Back to Toconao and their way of dealing with water. In Toconao, the irrigation turns are getting farther and farther apart as water is pumped in the mines to get more lithium, to support our dreams of progress. the communities in Toconao have to take these turns further apart. Limitless growth here anywhere hasn't never been an option, even though we thought so. So as the metaverse and low latency digital subjectivities expand, in Toconao we have this tension between these two systems of understanding resources and water. As a good news is that the Chilean government, the new government of Gabriel Boric, has stepped in the conversation together with many court cases that were won by the indigenous communities in Atacama. So they rendered illegal the licitation of lithium that was assigned some months ago, and they are trying to step back and have a new national company of lithium and include the indigenous communities and other sections of the population to discuss how to deal with this resource and how to manage this question of lithium in the country. But it's also something else, I think what I say, like this black hole or carbon hole in which we are through digital consumption, and something else that we have to discuss. So for me, when we think about the phone, our relation to the phone, I imagine ourselves like part of this extractivist industry. I mean, not to put the blame on the individual, but it's true that every selfie has some carbon footprint. And even the photos that we store in our phones and that we are not looking at, they are keep on consuming CO2. So in the way, I'm also thinking about the form of relation with mountains, relation with the soil and forms of extraction, and the way in which we extract ourselves. So how our digital, in a way, forms of, like our forms of relation with data, generation of data, is also a form of extraction of ourselves. Recently I wanted to buy an iPhone, a new iPhone, because mine was very old. I wanted to do this trip and have like some good photos, and I wasn't able to find one, which is very annoying. And sometimes we forget about where these also devices are produced. So I think there is many communities revolting, from the Foxconn workers in China that are the ones assembling the iPhone using the materials coming from Chile and other places, to the people complaining about the water scarcity in Bolivia and Chile and Argentina, to the fights that are also happening here in the northern countries, to the communities that are also protesting lithium mines in Portugal and in Spain, because now the European Union wants to be independent energetically and are forcing or are incentivizing the opening of new mines in countries like Portugal, Spain, Czech, or Serbia. So again, I want to think about how these communities come together to revolt, like literally the communities around the mines, but also the communities that are more than human. And in many cases, they come together, like the force of the mountain, the force of the soil. These are some of the protests that people in Portugal are staging, in which, if these areas are generally portrayed as remote, lifeless, the populations as non-educated, that they are not connected to progress, they are actually embracing the force of the mountain, the animalized force of the carnival and the other than human beings to go to protest. And this is happening in Zacatecas with artists like Naomi Rincón Gallardo, or in the carnivals in Galicia and Portugal that are also used by these protesters to carry protest. And I like this idea of like forms of solidarity that could be connecting to different beings that are at stake or have a stake in the struggle. Meanwhile, all these systems are also creating the disappearance of certain spaces entirely, so not only certain populations. And I wonder how we think about preserving through the digital again. So if sort of forms of development are triggering the climate catastrophe, and then we think about the same ones to preserve those territories, for me there is a contradiction. So my question is how to think about our relation with data and data infrastructure differently. And there are many, very quickly go through some examples. This is an indigenous-led data center in Australia. And there are a few of them. For me, it's interesting to think about how certain communities take ownership of these infrastructures and reinvent them. Also in terms of data governance, like, I didn't talk that much about surveillance, but obviously there are certain populations that have been under surveillance for a long time. This is in Chile, like some of the old devices I'm interested, like the quipu that was used by the Inca Empire for communication and storing of information. And it served to kind of guard or keep information secret from the Spanish conquistadors, because they were unable to read these notes and the information that was stored. It has been still very difficult to decode these systems that are almost early computers or early data centers, also based on binary code. So for me, it's also interesting the idea of like using digital infrastructure as a form of resistance. What type of forms of decentralized, in this case was, also an empire in itself, but in a way forms of encoding and decoding data that would be otherwise. For instance, how to embrace questions about digital decay. In some cases, we are not able to read the quipus. This beautiful, still today, even with the help of computers, we are unable to read the information. So there is a question of data decay, data loss, and data mourning. We don't know exactly all the information that is there, and at the end of the day, that is what happened with most of our information. We keep on storing information that would never be, read again, because actually, and this is an experiment, that's what I brought in. If you keep some files on storage for 90 years, they decay. They enter in decay naturally. So I'm interested in those conversations about the poor image. What if, instead of having high resolution as the end that we are aiming for, we start thinking about our relation to data through lower resolutions, forms of decay, and forms of incompleteness. So there are different artists working, this is Seville Camp, thinking about forms of also data ownership and governance, and form of colonial or post-colonial struggles in Nigeria through the digital as a form of incompleteness. Or magazines like this one that is also sometimes not fully on because it depends on solar panels to function. So sometimes it's off, and sometimes the quality of the images is not good. And there are other developments in which data generated by humans is also rewritten, and that's a project that Helena has been doing that is with DNA data storage, but connected to plant DNA data storage. And we find it interesting is also letting things go. So what happens with our data is not imagined as lasting forever, as in the case of DNA data storage understood by the industry, but thought through other forms of decay or manipulation. And I think, Elena, you maybe want to talk a bit about your own work.
Yeah, I'll just speak for a couple of minutes about, I think this project was about using DNA data storage in plants specifically as a form of resistance to create indeterminacy in the whole data industry. And so this form of data storage in DNA has been particularly successful within plants and seeds. But what we both find really fascinating is imagining a materiality for data storage in living plants. So say what happens if a forest is a data center, or a garden, or a public space within a city is a data center, and the impacts of that. So, firstly, obviously on the environment, what happens if you have a materiality for data storage that breathes and emits oxygen, as opposed to just extracting. And then secondly, in the creation of this idea of indeterminacy, and where plants have their own agency to decentralize the human. Because obviously when plants that have our data within them reproduce or cross-pollinate, they will end up in their offspring rewriting human data and human history. And that's what we're particularly interested in.
So to finalize this idea of thinking other form of data literacy, forms of storing, forms of consumption and production of data, and forms of letting our data go, whether it is through deleting data that will be more simple, or thinking about forms of data decay, learning to mourn forms of data knowledge that has to go, and even allowing other beings to rewrite our history. That's what we wanted to share today. Thank you.